What's up, Theory Creeps? As promised, this video is about the platform and the platform's use of allegory. We're going to be bringing in Walter Benjamin's The Origins of German Tragedy, in which he kind of works out a very interesting and kind of paradoxical theory of allegory. So today, talking about allegory, talking about the platform, talking about Walter Benjamin. So first, I just want to say that I really enjoyed the platform because of its limited scope. Allegories in general really benefit from a limited scope. They, when they start to sprawl, decoding them and finding their kind of hidden meaning becomes very difficult. The fewer things that are in them, fewer characters, places, events, etc., the easier it is to read an allegory. So the platform really benefits from its limited setting, limited characters, etc. It really reminds me of Dredd 3D.
Inhabitants of peach trees. This is Judge Dredd.
Which I realize is kind of an absurd comparison, but if you think about it, they're both kind of dark films. They have a very similar kind of filter applied to them, and they both take place in vertical settings. They both have very few characters. Anyway, thematically, they may be similar. They may not be. I don't know. I don't really want to get into that.
Mama is not the law. I am the law.
So the more important thing that I want to talk about, other than Dredd 3D, is allegory and how the platform uses allegory and how the platform kind of maybe critiques allegory. I don't know. We'll see. Above all, the allegory in the platform is overt. It's conspicuous. It really begs us to decode it. And people have. For the most part, videos about the platform on YouTube and other platforms have been very, very straightforward, just decoding the narrative, trying to tell us who Gurang is, who Tragami is. Just trying to decode these characters, trying to decode the setting, trying to tell us what the hidden message of the platform is. And this is not unique to the platform. This is how a lot of criticism of allegory is done. I think in general, it's how a lot of criticism is done. I think we force these kind of allegorical readings on texts and films. And it's hard to blame people, right? Like, we love to decode things. The human brain loves to find patterns. It loves to look for clues and feel like it's finding some, hidden gem in the sand. Like it makes us feel connected to something. It makes us feel involved. But there are some kind of hidden assumptions built into an allegorical reading. I think the biggest and most important one is that truth is out there and can be found. Now, truth in allegories and truth in Walter Benjamin's theory of allegory is complicated. It's not like we go looking for it and we find it, end of story. There's a kind of hiddenness to truth in allegory. It's a very old process. We've been analyzing and decoding narratives at least since the Old Testament. The hermeneutic process, writing in the margins of biblical texts, is something that monks and priests have been doing for 5,000 years. But that shouldn't add a layer of legitimacy to it, right? Just the fact that these dudes have been doing something for 5,000 years doesn't mean they haven't necessarily been wasting their time. So what is an allegory? Well, I guess that's kind of the subject of the video, but we need a definition of some kind. So let's call an allegory a story that isn't really about itself. A story that refers to grander political, philosophical, social ideas, right? That tries to tell a theoretical story underneath or on top of the superficial events of the story. The idea here, and again, this is something we talk about a lot in this channel, is about presentation versus representation. So what Benjamin is trying to say when he talks about allegory, and we'll get to this later, but just keep this in mind as we talk about the specific figures in the platform. Allegory implies an impossibility of presentation. of the truth, right? What is presented in an allegory is false. It is superficial. It is illusory. What's real in an allegory is behind that. So it's not presentable. It is only representable through interpretation. This is what makes allegory so interesting for me. Bernard Cowan, when he's talking about Walter Benjamin's theory of allegory, says that allegory could not exist if truth were accessible. He goes on to say that the first precondition for allegory is the existence of truth. And then the second precondition for allegory is that truth is not directly accessible. If it were, McCowan says, to repeat myself, allegory couldn't exist. To put that simply, if the truth could be said plainly without coding it in an allegory, allegory literally wouldn't exist. There would be no reason for us to write an allegory if we could plainly say what it is allegory is trying to say. So what is the hidden meaning of the platform? Again, this video, my video, not going to be about finding hidden meanings in the platform. I'm really not interested in doing that. A lot of people have done that. I don't feel like I have anything unique to say. I think a lot of the connections that the platform makes are pretty transparent. We get it, you know. Gehring is, he's the worker. He's the proletariat. He tries to get a job at the pit. He applies for it as if it's a job. It's something that he wants to get. He doesn't have it yet. They kind of dangle it in front of him the same way that we dangle, low income, minimum wage, part-time positions in front of the working class as if they're like a treat that they should be grateful to receive. And that's exactly what's happening in the pit. So is the pit a capitalist narrative? Yeah, I think so to some extent, but there's more going on here. We could also say that Gehring is like Bugs Bunny. He's got a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, and they're both whispering in his ear, trying to get him to do the good thing or the bad thing. I guess to put it more academically, Gehring is the mortal. He's the individual in the Christian mythos, and then you've got virtue and sin on either side, right? Tragazamine, the old man, he kind of represents capitalism and capitalists and selfishness and self-interest. And then you've got, I'm just going to call her Imogen because I knew an Imogen once, and her name is hard to say. It seems like it might be the Spanish Imogen. So Imogen is like the good, she represents caring for people, equal distribution. So is she a socialist in the capitalist reading, or is she like a priest or a saint or just an angel or the good, virtue? I don't know. Could be both. Again, we can see this dual meaning in the setting of the platform, the pit, or I think they call it the pit, the pit that they all live in, could be a representation of hell, could be a representation of, Dante's entire kind of divine comedy where you've got limbo, hell, and heaven above it. That's not a hard argument to make, but you could just as easily make the argument that it's representation for the kind of classist hierarchies of capitalism where the rich benefit and the poor get nothing. Again, capitalist, religious, they're both getting mashed up in the platform. So this smashing up of different meanings and different interpretations is problematic for an allegory because allegories, if you're an English major, you already know this, allegories are defined as having singular meanings. So, for example, in Plato's The Cave, which is an allegory we talk about in this channel all the time, the cave refers to one thing. It refers to the mindset of someone who believes that the material world is all there is. Period. Plato does not want you to think that it means other things. And because academics and English professors love to categorize things. When something means two things or multiple things, it becomes a symbol. So an allegory has singular meaning, symbolism has multiple meanings. One way that this gets taught, and it's a pretty good way to describe it, is Moby Dick is a symbol, and Moby Dick had to be as big as he was to shove all the different reference into him. Moby Dick is the devil. Moby Dick is lack of knowledge and the unknowable, chaotic world. Moby Dick is the dragon and St. George and the dragon. Moby Dick is the great vastness, numinousness of the sea. Moby Dick is so many things that he may as well not be anything. And that is not how an allegorist wants you to read an allegory. An allegorist wants you to make one connection. That is not what happens in the platform. In the platform, there are at least two different, very distinct narratives, the Christian narrative and the socialist narrative. So for Benjamin, this hiddenness of truth is very important. And the singularness of the meaning of an allegorical symbol is very important. He says, and he's talking about the profane world here. He's talking about the material world, which in an allegorical sense refers to the superficial narrative, not the interpretive narrative. He says, any person, any object, any relationship can mean absolutely anything. With this possibility, a destructive but just verdict is passed on the profane world. It is characterized as a world in which the detail is of no great importance. All of the things which are used to signify derive from the very fact of their pointing to something else, a power which makes them appear no longer commensurable with profane things, and which can indeed sanctify them. Considered in allegorical terms, then, the profane world is both elevated and devalued. So I guess we could say that what the platform is doing is it's trying to synthesize, to use a Hegelian term, socialism and Christianity. It's trying to generate a Christian socialist narrative. Could be. I don't think that's what's happening because I've just given you two readings off the top of my head. I'm sure if you put a lot of work into the text, you could find more readings. And this is really the problem with the assumption that allegories can ever refer to one specific thing. The singularity of truth, again, is a very Platonic notion. And even when I was in my undergrad and we were being taught the difference between allegory and symbolism, it seemed troubling to me because another comparison that gets used a lot when you're talking about allegory is that allegory is like speech. There's an object, or it's like a traditional understanding, traditional kind of semiotic understanding of speech. There's a sign, and then there's the signified. There's the object, and then there's the word about that object, right? So the object is truth, and the word is, in the case of Plato's The Cave, light, the sun. Again, it's a singular object. There's the sun, one sun in the sky, shines down, shows us the truth, right? But that's not how language works. And again, I'm just fucking spouting Derrida here, but that's not how speech works. Speech has like a word has countless meanings that can be applied to it, and it exists in a network of differentiation. It has no specific object. It's not a lot of things, and it is a few things. And because it's not a lot of things and is a few things, it's useful for us as a way to communicate with each other. It doesn't actually refer to any kind of singular true object in the world. The serpent's promise to the first men was to make them knowing both good and evil. But it is said of God after the creation, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Knowledge of evil, therefore, has no object. There is no evil in the world. It arises in man himself, with the desire for knowledge, or rather for judgment. Knowledge of good, as knowledge, is secondary. It ensues from practice. Knowledge of evil, as knowledge, this is primary. It ensues from contemplation. Knowledge of good and evil is then the opposite of factual knowledge, related as it is to the depths of the subjective. It is basically only knowledge of evil. So what Benjamin is doing here is he's using a Christian allegory, the Garden of Eden, the Book of Genesis, etc., and he's using it to talk about allegory in general. He's trying to show us that even in Christian allegory, the material world doesn't offer us any knowledge. Literally, knowledge of good and evil was not in the world as God made it. It's something that we bring into the world. And I think this is also true of allegorical texts. The material, physical, superficial existence of an allegorical text is not where the knowledge or the truth of the text is. Natively, there is no knowledge in an allegory. There's no truth. Truth is something that we import into an allegory when we interpret it. I think we kind of see this representation or this approach to truth in the platform as well. Like, we know where the good is. It's up there. Or maybe not the good, but we know where representation is. We know where the story finds truth. It finds it up because we see the upper world. It's well lit. We hear people talking in it. We understand the world. It's implied that this is the world that Goring comes from, but we don't see the bottom. In fact, no one knows how far down the pit goes. So the truth of the story, the unknowable, allegorized truth, what the thing that people are going to try to decode is what's at the bottom of the pit. Where is evil in this story? Where is the bad in this story? It's not just that truth is not representable, it's that truth has no original presentation. It's that truth is only representation. Baynard Cowan says, and this is a tricky quote, so we're probably going to spend a little bit of time with it. He says, "The ennobling of allegorical objects by contemplation cannot outbid their irreversible deadness. Instead of dialectical regeneration, the result is irony. The risus sardonicus." So the ennobling of allegorical objects by contemplation. That's pretty obvious, right? He's talking about the process of hermeneutics, the allegorical interpretive process that we all go through when we watch an allegorical film. So Cowan is saying that we can't enrich these objects beyond their death. They're dead. They're superficial, flat narratives, and although we feel like we're elevating them and ennobling them, like the platform going up, that's not really what's happening. Their deadness is irreversible, according to Cowan. So instead of a dialectical regeneration, whereby through no longer being historical and becoming symbolic, these objects kind of gain a new life, the result, says Cowan, is irony. So what does he mean by that? Well, irony is all about mixing expectations, right? We expect one thing to happen. We expect a phrase to have one meaning, and then it's the opposite. And then we laugh. Ha ha. Meaning is complicated, isn't it? So that's what irony is here. And I think that's what Cowan is trying to get us to think about. He's trying to show us that we think we're elevating a symbol like the platform, like the cave, but really all we're doing is we're just playing with the dead thing. I think that Cowan is actually being quite critical of Benjamin's approach to allegory here, and I think I side with Cowan over Benjamin. Because for Benjamin, the truth is out there. The truth is not knowable. It's not presentable. It's only representable through interpretation. But for Benjamin, and you also see this in his theory of aura, there is an authentic singular truth. Benjamin is suspicious of reproductions. He likes original things, and I think this has to do with Marxism and his kind of Marxist origins, because Marxism is all about the investment in labor that a worker has and the kind of emotional benefits that a worker gets from their labor and how that's taken away from them by mass production. So when people interpret films like The Platform the way that they tend to interpret them, which is a one-for-one kind of decoding, they ignore the multiplicity of potential readings that are available to us when we watch a movie like The Platform, and above all, they make assumptions about reality and about truth that are very old, and I don't think these people who make these videos are aware that they're endorsing a kind of Platonic position, a kind of Platonic understanding of truth, that it's not in the world, that it is, like the Christians tend to believe, that it is outside of the profane, sinning, messy, changey world, and it exists in this kind of singular, detached, unchanging dimension. And this assumption is dangerous, like politically, like socially. It's a justification for, again, a kind of dogmatic mindset that doesn't help us deal with the world. It imposes a kind of rigid framework onto a very flexible, messy thing, and doesn't give us the flexibility to deal with the kind of chaos that we see in the postmodern world. And I don't mean to use the word postmodern to refer to the present. Like, I feel like a lot of the conditions of postmodernism are universal. I think subjectivity and interpretation and a kind of lack of truth, they've always been a part of the world. And with that in mind, I think we can kind of see The Platform as an indictment of truth itself. Because where is the meaning in The Platform? Where is the singular, identifiable, discrete, unchanging, true kind of narrative? There isn't one. As I was watching the movie, and obviously this is a subjective kind of experience, I found myself thinking about, again, Christian narratives, John the Baptist, when I was watching his friend and him enact their plan. I was thinking about capitalism at the beginning of the movie when Tagazamin, whatever his name was, was telling him about like selfishness and showing him, felt like he was almost teaching him how to like run a small business or something during some of these scenes. So it was all over the place for me as far as what the film referred to. And by the end, when you had, a pretty overt Christian narrative tied up with this very capitalist symbol of the expensive cake, I forget what it was called. That probably had a symbol tied to it as well. I just don't know anything about Spanish cuisine, or was it a French dish? I don't know. All these mixed symbols, all these mixed meanings, they made it feel to me like this film may have been an allegory. Its form of allegory may have been an indictment of the grander form of allegory in general. I think this indictment is most obvious when you look at the book that Goering brings into The Platform with him, or into the pit. with him. It's Don Quixote. Now, I didn't notice this when I first watched the film. I had to watch a few YouTube video analyses of it to make this connection. So I guess it was made for me to some extent. But a lot of people point out that he looks a lot like Don Quixote. He's tall. He's got the what's that? The mustache and the goatee. There's a name for that combination. Yeah, so he is a Quixote, I think is the term. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. He is like Don Quixote. It's a quixotic narrative, is what people say when a book kind of mimics Don Quixote, which is to say you have a character who is chasing something that's not there. They have a dream. They're a dreamer. They're an idealist. They live in the world of ideas, not the world of physical things. Don Quixote sees giants where there are windmills. The implication, a lot of these YouTube videos that I watched say, is that Don Quixote and the quixotic narrative are meant to kind of complicate the allegorical structure of the film in a very straightforward way. You know, some people say it's a leftist narrative, it's a socialist narrative, but at the end there's this kind of quixotic confusion where we don't really know if the utopian kind of leftist goals of the film are achievable, and the film kind of leaves it ambiguous about whether or not Goering gets what he wants and, you know, achieves the kind of socialist enlightenment that he's looking for. Conversely, if we look at it as a Christian narrative, we don't know if he makes it out of hell. You know, we don't know if he is saved. So the quixotic kind of reading of the narrative goes that it's complicating the kind of ethics that it's representing, that it's a morally ambiguous story. I don't think any of that is true. None of that sits right with me. Obviously, Don Quixote is a very important figure in this movie, or else they wouldn't have given their lead actor Don Quixote's facial hair and a copy of Don Quixote to read. What's interesting about a copy of Don Quixote appearing in this text is that a copy of Don Quixote also appears in Don Quixote. In addition to being possibly the first European novel, it is also a very early representation of metatextuality. The writer of Don Quixote, not the actual writer, but the writer of the book in the book, is a character in the book. I believe he's an Arab historian, and Don Quixote encounters a translated, so a mitigated, a representation of his own life, which is very interesting. That's just kind of an aside. So, and we're going to end here because I can see that this video is going to be very long. But I want to end on the function of the Quixote in the platform. Who is Don Quixote in this narrative? Is it Goering? I cannot say his name right. No, I don't think so. I think that the Quixote is us. I think that it's the audience struggling to find meaning and truth in a narrative where there is none. And I think that in this way, the film isn't an indictment of socialism or an indictment of Christianity. It's an indictment of allegorical readings in general. We, the audience, as we watch an allegorical narrative, are Don Quixote. We're seeing windmills. We're seeing the profane, superficial structure of the story. But then we're imagining giants. We're idealizing something that isn't there. I think that the platform is above all, like I said, an indictment of truth, an indictment of a singular, discrete reading of anything. That's why it presents us with so many well-supported approaches to the narrative, and hidden, like superficially, the structure of the platform is an allegory. The hidden features of it are the failures of allegory. So Benjamin tells us that truth is non-presentable. It is only representable. Truth has to be hidden and coded. And very, very interestingly, the people who made Platform hid a truth inside of this allegory. The allegory of the leftist narrative and the allegory of the Christian narrative are themselves allegories for the process of reading an allegory. And the nugget of truth contained in that allegory of reading an allegory is that you can't read allegories, that there is no reality to be decoded behind an allegory. We're all just quixotic idealists dreaming of this singular truth that we're going to decode and find when we watch these movies, when really, as Cowan says, they're just dead things. And we ironically think that we're revitalizing them when in fact they're still just dead. Anyway, so with that, I hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are staying socially distant, because I'm certainly seeing a lot of people out my window not staying socially distant, which is, making me a bit nervous for the future. But anyway, stay inside, stay safe, and we'll catch you next time, guys. Theory Creep out.